Welcome back to Reality Asserts Itself on the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay. Joining us again for our continuing discussion on education and the politics of Chicago. And now we're going to move into a bit of the politics of the Democratic Party is Troy LaRaviere. Thanks for joining us. So one more time, Troy used to be a school principal at Blaine Elementary School and some vice principal at another school, but he was removed after speaking out against Rahm Emanuel and his handling of the Chicago public school system. And he's now running the Chicago Principal and Administrators Association, and he's exploring a run for mayor himself. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks.
So we've been talking about the schools and school policy. A lot of this comes down to the issue of the fight within the Democratic Party. This is like Baltimore. Chicago is a Democratic Party city. I don't know the last time there was a Republican mayor.
Not in my lifetime.
Yeah. And you can't elect a Republican in Baltimore as dog catcher. I think it's probably not so different in Chicago.
Right.
So these are very concentrated places where this fight in the Democratic Party takes place.
Right.
And we talk about this a lot on the Real News. And I've said many times that the Democratic Party is no different than the rest of society. There's a class structure within the party.
That's right.
And there's an oligarchy that controls most of the machinery of the party. Bernie Sanders waged a primary campaign and challenged that oligarchy in the Democratic Party. And you came out for Sanders, and we're going to play a little bit of a commercial that Troy did advocating for Bernie Sanders. Here's some of that.
In Chicago, we have endured a corrupt political system, and the chief politician standing in the way of us getting good schools is our mayor. If you have a presidential candidate that supports someone like our mayor, you have a candidate who's not willing to take on the establishment. Bernie Sanders is definitely not afraid to take on the system, that he looks beyond that system and sees better possibilities for us. He sees that this is not the way it has to be. That is why I support Bernie Sanders.
I'm Bernie Sanders, and I approve this message.
So I mentioned earlier that coming out for Bernie Sanders and coming out against Rahm Emanuel is not the best career move for someone who might want a career within the Democratic Party, or at least not the normal career against the Democratic Party. But how do you envision the bigger struggle in the party? There's Bernie Sanders, there's people like Nina Turner, there's a lot of organizations that are planning to primary right-wing Democrats. I guess, in a sense, that's what you're exploring. When it comes, when you say running against Rahm Emanuel, it doesn't mean in the election, I assume. It means in a Democratic Party primary.
There are no primaries in Chicago.
Oh, there are no.
It's just, there's an election, and whoever gets the majority in that election wins. If no one gets the majority, there's a second election between the top two vote getters. That's what happened in the last election. There was a general election. The mayor was not able to get 50%. Chuy Garcia got enough of the vote to force a runoff. And the runoff was held about a month and a half later, if I remember correctly. And of course, unfortunately, Emanuel prevailed in that runoff. But there's no party election on the municipal level in Chicago for the Chicago mayor's race.
So that's because it's kind of all within the Democratic Party anyway.
Right.
So just how do you see this wider struggle? It's very concentrated in Chicago, but it's a reflection of a wider struggle. Is the Democratic Party, and I guess in some ways because it isn't a primary issue in Chicago, it's not quite the same issue as the national struggle. But is the Democratic Party worth fighting for? Is it something that can be changed? Is this kind of insurrection Sanders-esque thing that was?
I'm so glad you asked that question.
What can become of that?
So I think asking if the Democratic Party is worth fighting for is almost like asking, is America worth fighting for, right? That the party itself is the object of contestation. Like, there are different forces fighting for control of that party, just like there are forces fighting for control of this country, like there are forces fighting for control of our state, like there are forces fighting for control of our city, right? These are all institutions subject to the control of certain people and groups in this country. And the ones that matter most right now in terms of looking at the source of many of the problems in America, in Illinois, in Chicago, are what I like to call, what I typically call wealthy parasites. And I don't think all wealthy people are parasites, but there's a subgroup of the wealthy who seem to have as their sole goal in life to squeeze as much wealth out of the rest of us as they possibly can. And in order to do that, they wage war at every level they possibly can. They wage war for control of the Republican Party. They've won that one outright. They're waging a war for control of the Democratic Party, control of every city in this country, every state, and the country itself, right? And so every institution is a field in which they fight for control. And so asking whether or not the Democratic Party is worth it is like saying, well, let's just hand it to them. Well, if we're going to take that attitude, we might as well hand them the city, hand them the state, hand them the county, hand them the country. We have to fight the battle wherever the battle can be fought. I think we can actually wage a war for control of the Republican Party, frankly. I'm not for just giving that up. I think there are people within that party who are people-centered, who have there's certainly folks who have a working class mentality who seem to misidentify with the politicians they elect. I think that it's worth it to try and win the hearts and minds of those people as well. And if I think it's worth winning their hearts and minds for control of that party, I certainly think it's worth waging a war for the hearts and minds and control in the soul of the Democratic Party.
Part of that fight is against the kind of corporate Democrat, as it's called, policies that were associated with Bill Clinton, but also Barack Obama.
Right.
The way Barack Obama was very much about Rahm Emanuel. The two of them were on the same page. I've never heard that they were on different pages from each other in terms of how they dealt with the 07-08 crisis, even education policy. This issue of testing and all the rest. This fight, some people are suggesting, though, that the fight within the Democratic Party to fight against corporate Democrats kind of splits the opposition to Trump. And so it should be kind of quiet on this fight right now and just focus all the guns on Trump.
I don't agree. To some extent I don't, to some extent I do. So and let me answer it this way. I think oftentimes people who consider themselves progressive will sacrifice winning the war with their enemy in order to fight a battle with their allies. And so to the extent, it just depends on what the current fight is at the time, right? If we need to unite in opposition to Trump, whomever is in opposition to Trump, whether it be the neoliberal wing of the Democratic Party or the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, we need to join with them to defeat that enemy, to defeat that opposition. But there are also battles we wage on issues or on control of a particular local party. And at that point, we have to have that fight. Am I making sense here?
Well, yeah, I know it's a complicated balance.
So, for example, I will join with Rahm to fight Trump, but then the battle has to be had with Rahm too. Am I making sense?
Well, I guess the problem is that, in my mind, the policies of Barack Obama and Rahm Emanuel, but it's not just them individually, it's a whole philosophy of hyper-capitalism, privatization, and we know the numbers, the distribution of income after 07-08 crisis. I think it was 90% of the recovery of income went to less than 1% of the population.
Right.
Those policies created the conditions for Trump. And I think sometimes what happens in this idea that you have to unite to defeat Trump is that you don't keep reminding everyone that it's the Chuck Schumers of this world, it's the corporate Democrats of this world, including Barack Obama, it needs to be said, help create the conditions for such economic disparity, inequality, that this laid the groundwork for sections of the working class to vote for a Trump that wouldn't otherwise if there hadn't been such policies.
Absolutely, I agree. I am not for softening or running on, when I say I will join, I don't mean join with you on policies that I disagree with. You know, when we're talking about neoliberal Democrats and fighting Trump, we're usually talking about social issues, not economic ones. On economic issues, they're Trump. They are Trump. On social issues, they're not. And so if there's a social issue that I can join with a neoliberal Democrat and fight this particular administration along the lines of that social issue, then we fight. But when it comes to economic issues, the type of issues that pave the way for the election of Trump, there's no place where we can meet with the neoliberal wing of the Democratic Party. They have to be fought just as strongly as we fight with Republicans.
Well, when I ask you, is the Democratic Party worth fighting for, there's sort of an underlying assumption in what I'm asking. I don't know whether you can ever wrest the core of the machinery of the party out of the hands of corporate Democrats and oligarchs. The Russians are being accused of interfering in the elections, but people don't want to keep remembering what the interference was. Is they gave to Wiki. I'm even saying they, the Russians gave. Maybe I'm not even convinced yet. There's enough evidence to say it was the Russians, but whoever did it. It was an expose of how the DNC undermined the Bernie Sanders campaign,
right?
And the way the media works as well. There's a lot of clout, weight behind corporate Democrats that will try to stop this kind of war, insurgency in the Democratic Party. At some point, and I'm not suggesting it's now, but at some point, does there need to be another party? And if you think there might be, how do progressive forces get there?
So it depends on what your strategy is at the time. Right? If you want to win a presidential election, no. You need to take control of the Democratic Party. And I think the degree to which Bernie Sanders came that close to doing it shows that it is possible. If we have a candidate who can connect to the hearts and minds and the needs and the desires and the hopes and dreams of a critical mass of people, we can take a Democratic primary on a national level, on a state level, and on a local level. There may be some local races in which you can have a third party that can oust a neoliberal Democrat who is in office. It's about strategy. I don't see any situation in which a third party can do anything but hurt progressives in a presidential election. In a presidential election, we have to put our energy into taking back the National Democratic Party. And so I think it's all situation-based, it's goal-based. What is the smart thing to do in this particular situation? In some instances, it may be a third party. In others, it may be, let's take the Democratic Party back.
There's sort of a debate right now inside progressives in the Democratic Party over health care. And one side is saying, focus on the defense of the Affordable Health Care Act. Now the recall has burnt. There's probably going to be more emphasis on that. The other side is saying, including the nurses and others, nurses union, that head toward single payer, head toward Medicare for all. And that is the only real solution, that the Affordable Health Care Act may have been better than nothing, but it was really not a solution. What's your take on that?
I am with the nurses. That it is always best not to give, don't compromise and give up at the start of the debate. You push for your dream, right? Single payer. I think that's part of what happened when the Affordable Care Act was being negotiated. The president and his people gave up too much on the front end. And, as a result, things like the public option were removed from it. They did not fight hard enough to keep that in. There was not enough strong public messaging to keep that in. Part of it is because that's what they started with. They didn't start with single payer and then maybe bargain away that for a public option. They gave up single payer in the beginning and then began to argue with a public option, which they then had to bargain away.
Because I think the Democratic Party leadership didn't want a single payer.
But many of them did not.
They didn't even allow it to be raised in the Senate hearings.
The president acted as if he did. I don't know if he did or didn't, but if he did, he gave it up too soon. And even if he didn't, and he wanted a public option, then he should have started with single payer and bargained down from that. When you give up so much ground in the beginning of negotiations, you give up to your opponents, and you give up in terms of the hearts and minds of the people, because now you're seen as not budging. You're seen as not budging because you started off budging. Am I making sense here? And so I think the same kind of logic should apply to the current negotiations or the current public conversation about where healthcare should go. We have to push for single payer and push forward as strongly as possible, whether we get it or not. We are advancing the argument for a healthcare system that gets as many Americans the healthcare they need as possible.
Probably the biggest threat facing the people of Chicago, bar none, is the same threat facing the people everywhere else, and that's climate crisis, climate change. Given that a denier of climate crisis, climate change, has been elected president, and they control the entire federal government, it looks like the only real breakthroughs, if there's going to be any, are going to be at the level of cities and states. If you're mayor of Chicago, I'm interviewing you like you're already running. How serious do you take that? Because even in the progressive discourse, I'm finding that there's so many immediate issues, like these, school systems being destroyed, or in places like Baltimore or Chicago, for that matter, crazy high murder rates and chronic poverty and so on. But the existential crisis facing the whole society is climate crisis, and it barely gets talked about.
Right. So, as with any other issue, and I think I mentioned this before, you have to focus on what we know and have a messaging strategy. Like, you're trying to win hearts and minds. You're trying to win hearts and minds, and you're trying to get people active in fighting for a particular outcome. And so, as with every other issue, we have to focus on what we know, and that means looking at what the research says, finding very sort of cogent, easy to understand ways of talking about it relentlessly and repeatedly to try and create the demand for the change that you want to see happen, and a way to get people who are already convinced of the need for change involved in some collective actions, some repeated, consistent collective action to demonstrate and push for those changes.
We talked a little bit off camera in between segments, and you were asking me when I was kind of pressing you on this fight taking place and all that, what I meant by it, and I'll phrase the question again. Whether it's climate crisis, whether it's schools, it seems to me real solutions, effective solutions, means taking on the oligarchy, the way Sanders talks about.
Right.
It's going to be a real war. You're talking about driving a stake into the heart of very big economic interest. To do that, do you think the electoral process is enough? Don't you not also need a very serious mass movement to go with the electoral politics?
Absolutely. I think that's part of, when I talk about a messaging strategy, I'm not directing that strategy at solely on getting votes. I mean directing that strategy at helping to produce the kind of public consciousness that creates and informs mass movement. I don't think there's been any major social change in this country that has taken place purely on an electoral framework. That there's always been a mass movement. There's always been people in the streets. There have always been strikes. There's some kind of public stand that has to be taken by a critical mass of people. And anybody wanting to produce that change has to have a strategy of connecting with the grassroots and working with them to produce the kind of movement, the kind of demonstrations, the kind of public acts, the kinds of civic disobedience that forces the powers that be to bend to the public's will. And if that does not take place, it's not going to happen.
All right, just finally, as someone who's exploring again, running for mayor, not yet, and now it's running for mayor. If you're going to be mayor, you're going to have to deal with policing. And I know in Baltimore, we've done a lot of coverage of the issue of policing, and one of the things that's come up as a proposal for solving some of the problems, at least mitigating some of the abuses of policing, although it's a two-sided problem, the abuses of policing and then the violence that goes with chronic poverty. But in terms of mitigating policing, is civilian control of police, real control, where civilian, some kind of perhaps even elected civilian oversight board with the power to hire and fire a police chief. Something in that realm. What's your thinking on that?
So I think to deal with police violence, there has to be a two-pronged strategy. One of them has to be an accountability, and the other has to be building the capacity of police themselves. You know, I had a listening session with a group of policemen in Chicago, for example, and one of the things they talked about most was the lack of training and support that they have or don't have. And so there has to be a framework through which we think about the kind of city and the kind of policing we want and what kind of training and atmosphere and support do we have to give to police? Do we have to make available to them to produce it? I think of it a lot. I think of it the way I think about teaching, for example. There's this conversation about teaching and learning in Chicago and across the country about bad teachers, right? We have to evaluate these teachers, and the teachers who aren't doing very well, we need to get rid of them. Well, what we did when I went to Blaine was we supported our teachers up front. We gave them a maximum amount of training, professional development, opportunity to collaborate and learn from each other. And when that did not work, that was when accountability happened. I think it has to be the same thing for police. We have to give them what they need on the front end, but there also has to be a strong system of accountability for those who do not respond.
Well, would that include civilian control of police?
It would include, this reminds me of the elected school board question in Chicago. You know, they think we should get rid of mayoral control and have an elected school board. And we can have an elected school board that is in the pockets of the same people who Emmanuel is in the pockets of. And so I am generally support it, but there have to be mechanisms in it to ensure that the people who end up on it will actually hold the police accountable. Am I making sense here? Because you can have something that's called a civilian accountability board that is no better than in Chicago, IPRA, the Independent Police Review Authority, that pretty much gave a pass on every single case. And so in general, I support it, but it has to be designed like, you know, the devil's in the details. So it has to be designed to produce real accountability. So you have to get in there and look at the nuts and bolts of how people are put on that board. What are the qualifications, if any, that are designed to ensure that the people who end up on it will actually have the kind of competence and independence that will allow them to conduct their reviews adequately and effectively. Am I making sense here?
Yeah. All right, this is just the beginning of a conversation. So we'll pick it up again, I think, next time in Chicago.
Okay.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you for joining us on Reality Asserts Itself on the Real News Network.